one of the most prolific and widely recognised horror authors of all time, Stephen King's body of work has more than its fair share of what could have been in regards to how his stories closed out. Sometimes these changes are relatively minor and don't affect the overall narrative beyond a few minor details. Other times, they have massive, wide-reaching consequences that stretch beyond just the initial novel and into spin-off and crossover works. Whether it's a few small changes to the final chapters or massive overhauls of entire stories, here are some of the endings that very well could have been, but never were. I'm Ellie with What Culture, here with 8 alternative endings to Stephen King novels that were originally planned. Number 8. The Shining, after the play. The Shining seems to have a thing when it comes to cut endings. Notably, the 1980 Stanley Kubrick film adaptation had its original final scene cut from all release prints at Kubrick's request after its opening weekend. But maybe Kubrick was only sticking to the tradition of the novel, which had its own removed final section. King originally wrote a prologue and epilogue to his novel, entitled Before the Play and After the Play, respectively. Both were cut before publishing. Explanations differ, with a common one being that King's editor insisted on cutting down the page length in order to save on printing costs. The former was later published in Whispers magazine in August 1982, and an abridged version appeared in the April 26 to May 2, 1997 issue of TV Guide to promote the then upcoming miniseries adaptation. The latter was thought lost completely, even by King, but was rediscovered in 2016 in an early manuscript of the novel. Both eventually were published in whole as part of the novel's deluxe special edition by Cemetery Dance Publications, released in early 2017. The epilogue doesn't add much plot-wise, comprised mostly of newspaper clippings from stories published in the wake of the book's event, a la Carrie. The prologue, on the other hand, is a short story recounting events at the Overlook years before the arrival of the Torrance family. Number 7. The Stand, Flag survives and starts anew. King's 823-page post-apocalyptic opus received a massive boost in relevancy these past few years, what with the story's tale of a world-ending plague having an uncomfortable poignancy in light of the recent COVID-19 situation. But before all that, when King was still writing the novel in between bouts of writer's block, he penned an epilogue that didn't see the light of day until 12 years after initial publication. The proper ending sees big baddie Randall Flagg, a dark sorcerer building a cult of followers in the post-apocalypse, caught in a nuclear explosion that kills him and all his disciples. Later, 2 survivors, Stu and Fran, contemplate the future of humanity. "Do you think people ever learn anything?" "I don't know," she said at last. She seemed unpleased with her answer. She struggled to say something more, to illuminate her first response, and could only say it again. "I don't know." It's what Alison Flood at The Guardian called bleak but honest, and generally in keeping with the severe but ultimately idealistic tone of the rest of the novel. However, King's cut epilogue, which finally saw public eyes in the complete and uncut edition published in 1990, is less so. It reveals Flagg somehow survived the explosion and teleported away at the last second, winding up on a remote island in the southern hemisphere populated by primitive, simple, unlettered people. Flagg immediately begins recruiting new adherents and starting anew. A much less ambiguous and far more blatantly cliffhanger ending for sure, and uncertainly not without resolution considering Flagg's consistent later appearances in King's other works, particularly the Dark Tower series. Notably, however, it wasn't featured in the 1994 ABC miniseries written by King himself, after it had already been published. This isn't even King's only alternate ending to The Stand. The final episode of the CBS series, written by King himself, also featured an all-new coda that King had thought about for 30-odd years. Number 6. Salem's Lot, Father Callahan's Suicide. Salem's Lot follows writer Ben Mears returning to his eponymous hometown only to find it infested with vampires. The finished novel sees Mears' fellow vampire hunter Father Callahan attempt to confront the centuries-old lead vampire Kurt Barlow, only for Barlow to reveal the cross has no power over him because of Barlow's lack of faith, and forcing him to drink his vampiric blood, making him unclean. The last we see of the good father is him fleeing from Salem's Lot, infected with Barlow's vampirism, at least until the character reappears in the Dark Tower series. That is, in the published version. In a deleted scene from King's original draft, depicted a different fate for the priest. Rather than forced to drink Barlow's blood and leaving town damned, he marks the vampire with a knife before killing himself. Furious, the vampire desecrates the priest's body, decapitating it and hanging it upside down. King cut the gruesome original scene before the book went to print, but was included in a section of deleted scenes featured in the deluxe limited edition released by Centipede Press in 2005 and the subsequent trade edition. Number 5. Misery, Paul's Skin Book. In his memoir on writing, King mentioned that his 1987 novel Misery nearly had a very different and much more gruesome ending. To recap, Misery follows novelist Paul Sheldon, who is taken in by an obsessive fan after a car crash, who, displeased with his change in genre and killing off her favourite character, physically and psychologically tortures him into writing a new novel that will revive said character and course-correct the perceived failings of his new output. When she learns of his escape attempts, she punishes him by cutting off his foot and thumb and leaving him wheelchair-bound. By the end, Paul manages to fight back and eventually frees himself of his tormentor. King pre-plotted the book story in advance, initially only intending it to be 30,000 words. It ended up being 4 times that length, and under the working title The Annie Wilkes Edition, King's original ending saw the titular Annie kill and skin her captive, feeding his remains to her pigs, and then bind the book he's been forced to write in his own skin. King said of that ending, "It would have made a pretty good story. Not such a good novel, however. No one likes to root for a guy over the course of 300 pages, only to discover that between chapters 16 and 17, the pig ate him." But that wasn't the way things eventually went. Paul Sheldon turned out to be a good deal more resourceful than I initially thought, and his efforts to play Scheherazade and save his life gave me a chance to say some things about the redemptive power of writing that I had long felt but never articulated. Number 4. The Dark Tower, The Gunslinger, Walter's Death. King's magnum opus, the Dark Tower series, started life as a series of 5 short stories, which King eventually revised and rewrote into what would become the first novel of the series, The Gunslinger. Originally published in 1982, King produced a revised version in 2003 in order to bring the book into better continuity with the rest of the series, adding some 35 pages. The change in ending is mostly subtle. In both versions, the gunslinger, Roland Deschain, awakens after a decade-long slumber induced by his nemesis Walter, aka the Man in Black, to find what appears to be his skeletal remains. In the original edition, Roland is certain of Walter's demise, but in the revised edition he speculates that the skeleton may just be a trick by the Man in Black and he's still out there. Furthermore, the original text indicates that the characters of Walter and Roland's former teacher-turned-enemy Martin Broadcloak were 2 separate and distinct characters. When this was retconned later in the series, King revised the text to match. He also foreshadowed Walter and Roland's third identity, Randall Flagg, something that was also revealed later in the series. Number 3. Blaze, Rewriting the Whole Damn Thing. King's 2007 novel was actually written in the early 1970s, before Carrie, offering the original draft to his publishers at the same time as Salem's Lot. When they chose the latter, King set his manuscript aside and sat on it for over 20 years. Before finally publishing it, King did more than just change a few individual scenes, but rather rewrote and re-edited much of the book from cover to cover to remove what he perceived as over-sentimentality. Since the book was originally written under King's Richard Bachman persona, it had a different tone and feel than the rest of his works that readers had gotten used to. As King said in a 2007 interview, "I have been thinking about Blaze off and on for a while, and every time I would think about it, I did the early books as Richard Bachman books, and this is going to be a Bachman because it came from the same time. It was written right before Carrie, and finally I thought to myself, the reason I've never done it was because, in my memory at least, it was a tearjerker of a book. It was kind of sentimental and just kind of... Every now and then I think of what Oscar Wilde said about The Little Match Girl. He said that it's impossible to read about The Little Match Girl without weeping tears of laughter. Something that is so sad it's actually funny." As of 2023, King has yet to release the original Bachman version of his novel. Number 2. Under the Dome, The Cannibals. King's 2009 novel, which later became the basis for CBS television series that lasted 3 seasons, began as another rather different work. The novel, which follows the inhabitants of a small town that is suddenly cut off from the rest of the world via an impassable, invisible barrier, started life decades earlier as a manuscript by King entitled The Cannibals. King started work on it in 1972 and continued on and off with it for some 10 years. The manuscript was handwritten and stretched some 450 pages. King first spoke about it during the filming of Creepshow, in which he starred, saying in an interview, "I've got about 450 pages done, and it's all about these people who are trapped in an apartment building. Worst thing I could think of. And I thought, wouldn't it be funny if they all ended up eating each other? It's very, very bizarre because it's all on one note, and who knows whether it will be published or not." Said novel was never finished after King apparently lost the manuscript. The days before the internet, and couldn't bring himself to start all over. He did, however, eventually rework many of his ideas from that book into Under the Dome. King later published a 61-page facsimile excerpt consisting of the first 4 chapters of the Cannibals after he was accused of copying the Simpsons movie for Under the Dome. Number 1. 11/22/63 Jake and Sadie never meet. 11/22/63 follows schoolteacher Jake Epping, who, after discovering a time portal to 1958, decides to go back in time to prevent the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, wreaking havoc on space-time and the fabric of reality. In the process, he meets and becomes engaged to a woman named Sadie Dunhill, helping her escape her abusive husband Johnny, but she dies helping him accomplish his mission of saving Kennedy. The finished novel sees Jake, after closing the portal and resetting the timeline, find an 80-year-old Sadie still alive since he never met her. When he meets her, she seems to have some sense of déjà vu. King's original ending, which he released onto his website in 2012, instead sees Jake find a news article about Sadie, in which he learns that she married a man named Trevor Anderson, with whom she has 5 children, 11 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. The two never meet or interact face to face. This ending was changed by King at the insistence of his son Joe Hill, himself a novelist.